Every holiday season, the town next to ours hosted a county event that was called the Winter Wonderland. It was a small festival that would be held in the center of a small town in upstate New York, and it was mostly just baked goods being sold by vendors, while local talents and artists would perform. It was usually a lot of fun, and almost every elementary school district in the county would go during the day and see Santa and all that fun stuff. That year was just like any other. It was so much fun at the actual Winter Wonderland. The hot chocolate was delicious. The people working as Santa's elves were very charismatic. It was great. The bus ride home was a different story though. As you might know, around December in New York, it gets dark pretty early, and this was a field trip where our parents had to pick us up at the school afterwards because it would have been too late to catch a bus home. So we left the Winter Wonderland around 4 in the afternoon, so it was already getting dark, and right before we left, it started to snow. This was nothing new though. It snowed all of the time, so none of us kids were worried. I'm sure the bus driver was doing his best, but sometimes accidents happen. As we were making our way down a hill that had a small bend towards the bottom, we all felt the bus shake a bit, and as we got closer to the bend in the road, the bus wasn't turning. The bus driver told everyone to hang on tight, and before we knew it, we were flying over the side of the hill. The bus tires tore through the freshly powdered snow on the ground as we barreled toward the trees ahead of us at what felt like light speed, but was probably like 20 miles an hour. I'll never forget the image of a bunch of my classmates scrambling to their seats, trying to get our seatbelts on, but most of us weren't fast enough. Most of my classmates ended up with just a few bumps and bruises. As for me and 2 other students, we went flying. You see, I was in an aisle walking around, even though the teachers told me not to, and when the bus lost traction, I couldn't make it to a seat in time. I was facing the back of the bus when it made an impact with the trees ahead of us. All I remember is being ripped backward off of my feet from the force, and then I woke up in a hospital bed 4 days later. When the bus hit the tree line, I, along with 2 other students, were launched through the front windshield of the bus. One of them ended up being just fine somehow. All she needed was a few stitches. I apparently went headfirst into a tree and had to be placed into a medically induced coma for a few days while doctors worked on my skull. As for our other classmate, he didn't make it out of the ambulance. He was the first of us to go through the windshield, and I believe the impact of the glass plus the impact of the frozen ground caused too much damage, both internal and external. Our school district never attended winter events that required buses again. Working as a driver for DoorDash has been a pretty good side job ever since I moved to Converse, Texas. I mainly pick up deliveries inside of San Antonio, but sometimes I will find ones that take me out of Converse and a bit into the country. Now, I used to not mind those deliveries, and I would pretty much accept any job that I could handle, but after this one incident that brought me to a Texas ranch, I will no longer go outside of the cities of Converse and San Antonio. It was around 8:30 p.m., and I picked up an order that brought me out to the middle of nowhere. That's the crazy thing about Texas. One second, you can be in a big city, and the next, there is practically nothing around you for miles. As I drove around looking for the entryway onto this massive property, I began following a large fence that ran alongside the street. I figured the fence would eventually lead me to the entryway, and I was correct. I pulled into a small driveway that led me to a large electric gate with a number pad that required a code to get in. I wasn't given a code, so I decided to contact the person who sent out the order. They responded within a minute with a text that read, "The code, pound 6660. Welcome to the family." I was confused by that last line, but I leaned out of my car window and punched in the code, chuckling to myself at the fact that they used 666 for a code. After a second, the gate made a loud banging sound and then slowly slid open across rust-covered tracks. The gate opened to reveal a long, winding pathway with trees lining both sides of it. They must have been planted there by the owners a while back because they looked oddly out of place compared to the barren fields that surrounded the ranch. I began to make my way down the driveway, and I couldn't help but shake the creepy feeling that was coming over me. I was on edge, which I'm glad for because as I rounded one of the small bends, in the middle of the driveway my headlights revealed a tall, pale man wearing a dirt-covered black suit. We stared at each other for a moment without either of us moving. I was in shock. Eventually, I got the courage to roll my window down a bit and yell out, "Did you order the takeout?" But he didn't answer. All he did was step to the side and point down the driveway, as if telling me to continue. Reluctantly, I did. I continued down the pathway, and behind every couple of trees, I can't help but think that I see more people dressed up in a similar suit as the man who had been standing in the driveway. Still, I continued on. Finally, I could see a house in front of me, but as if it was something out of my worst nightmare. Standing on the porch of the large house and along the outside of the driveway were at least a dozen or more men, all dressed in dirt-covered suits, some black and some gray. I froze. I didn't know what to do, but I knew for a fact that nothing could make me get out of my car at that moment. After sitting in the driveway, staring at the group of strange men, I noticed that one of them had something in their hand. My eyes widened as I realized what it was, and I quickly threw the car into reverse. One of the men on the porch was carrying a rifle of sort. I wasn't close enough to see what kind it was, but I knew it was a firearm of some sort. I slammed my foot on the gas and began swinging my car around in reverse to turn around so that I could drive out of there as fast as I could. At that point, I noticed a few of the men now begun walking toward my car. After fully turning around, I put my car into drive and began flooring it. I let out a scream as I heard a loud bang followed by my rear windshield shattering. I leaned forward and made my head as low as possible while still being able to see over the dashboard. As I made my way down the driveway, every tree that I passed, I could see a man stepping out from behind it and walking toward the path that I had been driving down. Luckily, none of them seemed to be armed. I made it out of the driveway and onto the road, and as I passed the still open gate, I noticed that it began to close. They were trying to trap me inside with them. I sped down the road and called 911 as I made my way to the police station and explained to them what just happened to me. They were confused when I told them the address because they were familiar with it, and it had apparently been an abandoned property for the past decade. By the time the officers made it to the ranch, however, they said it appeared to still be abandoned and there was no one around. 3 hours after I finally got home, around 2:30 a.m., I received a text message saying, "Where'd you go? It was just getting fun." That was the last time I ever took an order outside of the city.
I've been urged by those close to me to share my account of a recent life-changing event I experienced while working the drive-thru window at my fast food job. Until this happened, I had yet to fall victim to the irrational angers some carry around all day inside of them. I was unaware of how easily they can be triggered, and now that I have seen it firsthand, I'm not sure I'll ever be able to fully trust another human again. Although, at this time it is still very difficult for me to relive the event, I am encouraged that, to do so through this post, I may be able to begin to take charge of my life again. I guess I'll start at the beginning in order to make what came next make more sense. My name is Zoe Marie, but my friends call me Zoe. I'm currently 17 and will soon graduate high school a year early because I was allowed to skip ahead a grade when I was younger. In order to instill a strong work ethic into their young daughter, my parents encouraged me to get a job once I had turned 16. Not being one that wanted to disappoint my parents, I soon found a part-time job at a chain burger and fries restaurant near my home. I would often ride my bike the 2 miles after school and work a few hours during the weekdays and longer shifts on weekend evenings. So I had always had all of my things paid for up until that time. Seeing each check filled me with a mixture of awe and achievement. These feelings appeared to have done exactly what my parents had hoped and fired my will to work even harder. I'm not sure if this desire spawned from a place of greed. I'm sure the argument could be made. Nonetheless, I did look forward to each shift. My shift that night had started at the counter, but once the girl working the window ended her shift, I was moved to her station. At the time, I had no preference between counter and window. You came into contact with the rude and crude working both, and this night was no different. I had already had a big fat woman with her 3 snotty-nosed children in tow scream at me for making a small mistake in her order. Perhaps the only benefit I did have was that I rarely worked after midnight, so I didn't have to deal with many intoxicated customers that came later. The 1 or 2 times I did work later, I found it a trying experience. I'll keep my moral views to myself. I will only say that I see those who partake of alcohol as weak, and I'll leave it at that. My shift was ending in around an hour when I met my last customer. From the way the gentleman was speaking, I could tell he had been drinking that evening. The transaction was a string of confusion and chaos. He changed the order multiple times, and those in the car with him sounded as confused as him. The entire mess came to a head when I informed him that our shake machine was out of order. I'm aware that most drive-thru workers will use that as an excuse, but I promised that night it was certainly broken. When I told him this, I was assaulted with a tirade of curses and derogatory names, and then he went silent. At first, I believed that there was something amiss with the headset, but I was wrong. The quiet was shattered by the squealing of tires. The cry of the tires was almost instantly joined by the roar of gunfire. I still believe to this day the only thing that saved my life was the sound of the tires. When I heard them, I leaned a bit forward in the window, almost putting my head out of the doors. I had only expected an angry confrontation at that second, but coming face to face with the barrel of his gun as he extended his arm from his window, I instinctively ran for cover. The countless bangs from the gun and the screams of my fellow employees seemed to last a lifetime. No matter how I tried to drown them out by covering my head with my arms, they remained just as horrifying. I'm not sure when the firing finally stopped, but I didn't even consider raising my head until another of the employees shook me. I guess at the time he was checking to see if I had been struck by any of the bullets, but regardless of his intent, I hesitated a moment before I sat upright. To my dismay, 2 of the others working that night had been injured, and although neither of them died, I couldn't return to that restaurant or any of its kind for quite some time. Just now, over 6 months after this happened, can I finally see a business with a drive-thru window without having a panic attack? In the months since the attack, I have spent a large amount of time and energy in counseling in the hopes of regaining my courage and ability to be a useful member of society again. Whether it's due to feelings of guilt or fear, the road has been a hard one, and if it were not for the sense of purpose and the hard work ethic my parents have helped foster in me, I may not have even made it through school. Despite my heartfelt hopes and many prayers, the police have yet to find or arrest the thugs that attempted to take my life because of a freaking shake machine. The best I can do is continue to have faith in law enforcement and the universal force of right. I know someday, some way, they will be made to pay for what they have done. The only real solace I can find is the fact that no one has lost their lives because of something I did or said.
It was the summer of 2015, and I had just gotten my first well-paying job at a gas station. It was one of the more bigger gas stations you'd see about halfway to a destination to stop for food or to use the restroom. While it might have not been the most exciting job in the world, it was definitely one that paid a substantial amount of money. For reference, I'm a female and was 24 years old at the time. I'm pretty short and weigh around 100 pounds. At the time, I didn't have a car, so I had to rely on taking the public bus to get to and from work. Since business was usually pretty slow during the night shift, my manager allowed me to chill out behind the counter if I had nothing to do. Sometimes you'd have your occasional 2 or 3 customers come in at around 1 a.m. for a late night snack, but other than that, the store was mostly dead. Most of the time, I'd be at the front minding my business, scrolling through Instagram and whatnot. It was a chill and great opportunity for me to catch up on my personal needs as well. One night, my manager had asked if I could work late as the guy working after me had suddenly quit and went to go make a living in watchmaking. Apparently, this guy obviously hadn't heard of a 2 weeks notice before, so I was livid to say the least. Whatever, it was extra pay and I couldn't afford to fall behind on rent. With me practically working double shifts at this point, I was running the store for long hours into the night. Some nights I'd have to bring my coffee to help keep me awake as the job could get boring pretty quickly. For the first few months, everything seemed to be going well, and I was even able to catch up on my studies. I had worked with my other coworker, Brandon, but we never really exchanged conversation as he mainly worked in the back. There was this one night, however, where something happened that little did I know would completely break me. I was working my usual nightly shift and I was cleaning up the floors after a customer had vomited from drinking too much. Once I clean everything up, I hear the door open and in walks a man with a backpack. He had a white beard and wore a dirty white tank top with cargo pants. I wave at him as a way of saying hello, and he then gives me an unsettling grin while looking back at me. I'm from the South, so it wasn't uncommon to see these types of people every now and then. He proceeds to grab a 6-pack of beer from our refrigerator and puts it on the counter, and I say hi once again. So, Ashley, what time are you at here? Right from the start, this guy smelled like straight up weed and I could smell the alcohol in his breath. I nervously chuckle and say, 7. Ah, I see. Do you need a ride? I can take you home. I tell him no thank you and that I already have one and change the subject by telling him his total. He gets out his wallet and proceeds to hand me a $10 bill, making sure our hands touched. I give him his change and tell him to have a nice night, and he then starts to ask if he could give me a ride home again. I tell him no, and he grabs his beer, giving me a wave before saying, "See you later, Ashley." He walks out the door, and I watch him get into his truck and drive off. He doesn't actually know when I'm off, so I figured I was out of the woods. A few hours go by and I finish up the remaining time for my shift before the person working after us comes in. I tell Brandon, who was still in the back, about what had happened, and he offered me a ride home so I wouldn't have to take the bus. Brandon and I walk out into the parking lot, and so far the coast seemed clear with no sign of the man. Long story short, he drives me home and I go to sleep until the following night. My mom had dropped me off at work and I go in to see my manager standing there. Upon entering, he immediately comes up to me and says, "Ashley, is everything okay? How did you get home last night?" I told him that Brandon gave me a ride home and my manager gets this confused look on his face. "Oh, that's weird because some guy came in just before 7. He said he was here to pick you up." When I was around the age of 20, I had just recently gotten my first ever paying job at my 24-hour local Taco Bell. The job was okay, it wasn't a well-paying job, and the other workers were somewhat rude, but it's better than not having a job. My first few months of working there went pretty well, of me being the cashier. I'd collect the money and take customers' orders, and the job was actually pretty easy, and I was fine with it. One day, my manager told me that I had to work the night shift for a week, 8 p.m. to 3 a.m. I was pretty upset, but I couldn't argue with him, so I took the shift. The first few nights went okay. After around 11 p.m., people would stop coming in, and I had maybe 3 or 4 people come in at around 1 for a taco or something. One night, it was around 12:30 a.m., and it was just me and 2 other workers who made the food. I was sitting down in one of the chairs playing a game on my phone when I heard the door open. I looked to see a man, I'd say in his mid-40s, with a hat and jacket on. He had a long beard and his hair was all messy and greasy. I politely welcomed him and asked if I could take his order, but he didn't say anything. He just stood in front of me looking at me with a blank expression on his face. I assumed that he was on something or had some sort of disability, but just then, he started to walk away and out the front door. I have to admit that I was a bit freaked out, but really thought nothing of it and continued to do my shift and whatnot. However, I then started to get the feeling that I was being watched somehow and was getting paranoid. Finally, 2 a.m. came around and the other employee, we'll call her Michelle, came in for her shift. Her and I were really good friends, so we chatted for a bit while I was finishing cleaning the counters. At some point in the conversation, she said that she'd be right back and that she had to use the restroom. A few minutes went by, which then turned into 10 minutes and eventually into 20. I then thought to myself, what could she possibly be doing in there that's taking her so long? At this point, I was starting to get worried and thought that something might have happened to her. I slowly walked over to the women's restroom and opened the door just a bit. However, I noticed that all of the lights in the women's restroom were off when they should have been on at all times. I turned them on and yelled out, "Michelle, are you okay?" There was no response from her. I wanted to let her have privacy, but I had the strong feeling that something wasn't right. I went inside calling Michelle again and again. Once I passed a stall, I heard what sounded like a light cry and whimpering. I opened the stall door and was shook with fear. I saw the same exact man from earlier holding Michelle while putting his hand around her mouth. That's not the most disturbing part though. The man was holding a large knife against Michelle's throat. Her eyes were filled with fear and was crying like crazy. She was scared for her life. The man then said in a raspy voice, "If you don't get all of that money from the register, I will slit her throat and blood will be all over this room." I was so scared that I couldn't even speak. I could tell that the more time I stood there, the more angry he got. I ran to the register and took all of the cash out in a bag and went to the bathroom and gave it to him. He then let go of her and pushed her to me. He ran out the front door, never to be seen again. All the while, Michelle was crying on me and thanking me for saving her life. We of course called the cops, but nothing ever came of the man. And the cameras we had in the store didn't help as the footage was too blurry to identify who the man was. Michelle and I quit a week later and both started working at a grocery store. However, sometimes I think that what would have happened to her had I not went into the bathroom to check on her. That still freaks me out till this day.
Hi everyone, my name is Ryan, and I'm from California. I know this story isn't going to seem as scary as a lot of the others covered on this topic, but it's still really unnerving to say the least. This happened during my senior year, which is 2018 to 2019. Now, this was a pretty normal day, until all the teachers got a call stating that we were on a lockdown. Of course, with the news of school shootings, any sort of threat was taken very seriously. It was during the middle to late portion of the school day, and I was at the point where I was really ready to go home. But of course, hearing about the lockdown made me really scared, that at the least, I would have to be there past when I was supposed to leave, or at the worst, me, a close friend, teacher, or someone else would end up seriously injured, or worse. We were stuck in a lockdown somewhere between half an hour to an hour until we were finally able to resume our day. I didn't really find out much information on the day of, but we eventually learned that someone was wanted for murder and was apparently hiding out in one of the streets in someone's backyard that was right on the side of my school. The person was caught and they had a standoff with the police. Now, my high school wasn't on any main roads, so tracking them down was a bit harder, but eventually the guy was caught hiding on one of the streets near the back-end streets near the science building, as well as near the portable classrooms. Luckily, none of the staff or students were hurt. I've learned to always be prepared for the unexpected, and to realize that you can never be too careful. Whether you're at home, work, or out and about, or even at school, remember that being paranoid or suspicious when it comes to these situations doesn't necessarily make you a crazy person. It can really help you in the right situation. This happened about 2 years ago when I was in the 6th grade. Everything was going really good for me until my cousin came to my school. I need to say that I came out as bisexual before he came, as it's somewhat important to the story. Anyway, there had really been some drama between my mom and uncle about 3 years before he came to my school. I won't go too in depth, but basically my uncle got mad at my mom because she wouldn't pay his share of a bill. He got really angry and he kicked us out. And I had basically forgotten all about it until he came to my school. He then started talking shit about me and my mom, saying we're poor because we couldn't pay rent. Mind you, that's not even what happened. I later went to the principal about it, but nothing ever came of it. Well, it got even worse when someone told him I'm bi. He then started calling me a bunch of horrible names. He would throw paper at me in the class we shared, and he would whisper to the people near him that I was the F slur. Those were his exact words. Now, you might be thinking, why didn't I just tell my mom what was happening? Well, I didn't because I was afraid that it would cause even more problems. More problems that I didn't need at the time. It made me really depressed. I would even fake being sick so I didn't have to deal with them. I had decided to go to school this one day because my friends kept asking me if I was okay. The next day when I went to school, the day started off as normal. I was in my 2nd class, which I didn't have with them. Well, about halfway into the class, the intercom had started, saying that we're going into a lockdown. We did all the standard lockdown procedures. 1 hour later, we had gotten an announcement saying the lockdown was over. They also said that it was apparently a student roaming in the 6th grade hall with a gun. That really freaked everyone out in the room because we all could have been shot. Summer was called early, since it was early May when this happened. Well, a few days later, we got a knock at the door from the police. Well, the police officer told us that apparently it was my cousin who caused the lockdown. They also told us that he said he was going to kill me because in his mind, all gays and weirdos need to die. It scared me to the bone to think that my own cousin would want to kill me at school, and in front of everyone there at that. The police officer said that he also admitted to stalking me at school, and sometimes even following me home since I walked and didn't live too far away from school. He had memorized my entire school schedule. We eventually moved away to another town where people were a lot more accepting. I've been going to therapy, and it's somewhat helped me recover from this. I still sometimes have nightmares about him breaking out of juvie and killing me in my sleep, or him killing me that day when he brought the gun to school. It's absolutely horrible. This happened to me back when I was around 12 years old. I was going through some of my old cringy notebooks and journals with my girlfriend, and I found my old journal entry where I wrote about this day, and all the memories came flooding back to me. I used to live in what I thought was a really safe and secure private community. I wasn't allowed to just wander around too far from home without supervision, but because our neighborhood was a gated community, my parents would let me walk around within the gates anytime that I wanted, even if they weren't home. One day I was riding around the neighborhood after school when I saw a middle-aged woman crying on the floor of her porch with the front door wide open. I was pretty concerned and got off my bike to see what was wrong. She said that she was having problems with her husband and immediately asked me to come in so I could keep her company while she calmed down. My stranger danger sirens were completely going off, so I declined. She kept pushing me. Please, just for a moment. I just need someone to talk to. Now, I was raised to always respect elders and to be a good person, but I was also raised to know about stranger danger. So being a young naive kid, I actually felt pretty conflicted about whether I should go in or not. Ultimately, I declined repeatedly enough that she instead asked me to wait outside with her and then sit with her until she felt better. I agreed to this since I felt very safe in my own neighborhood. She asked me to wait on the porch for her while she walked into the house and visibly grabbed a couple of framed pictures from off the wall. She then sat down next to me inside the house while I was sitting on the porch just outside of her door. She then started showing me the pictures. One was of a kid older than me in the local high school football uniform, and the other of a man and the same kid. She went on to tell me these stories about how she met him and how they spent their honeymoon in Hawaii and how her kid was so good at football, one of the best on his team. She was very worried that if her and her husband got a divorce, she wouldn't be able to see her kid anymore. And then she started bawling again, this time onto my shoulder. This actually caused me to let my guard down quite a bit. For some reason, once I knew she had a kid, I felt a bit more comfortable around her. She was talking for a while though, and I was beginning to start to feel a little awkward as she was on and off crying on my shoulder, and I didn't know how to react in the situation. What the heck did I get myself into? I kept thinking to myself as I nodded my head pretending to listen. I was more concerned about finding a good excuse to tell her I had to go home. She kept calling me such a young nice boy and telling me, "You have no idea how important it is for you to spend your time with me," which made me feel a little bad about just leaving her. She kept telling me that she wanted to reward me and make me some dinner if I just came in, which I continued to decline. Finally, I told her I had to go, and she asked me if I knew anything about how to turn on her cell phone, as she just got her first cell phone very recently. I told her I did and I could help her out before I left. She told me to wait yet again, and this time left for quite a while. I kept thinking I should just walk away, but part of me didn't want to be rude, especially since she lived right around the corner from my house and possibly even knew my parents. My anxiety levels would spike as I got closer and closer in my head to convincing myself to just stand up and walk away. Then it would just dissipate and I'd tell myself, "No, I can't just leave." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she brought me her phone, which was an Android. I had only had an iPhone 3G at the time, and it was my first smartphone, so I was a little worried that I wouldn't know how it worked. I just held the power button down for a second and lo and behold, it booted right up. She asked me then if I knew how to check text messages. I found and opened up the Messages app and there was only one number not saved as a contact in the app. She then pointed to it and said, "That's him. That's my husband's number. Read me his text." I opened it up. She had received basically the same text over and over again, just multiple variations on "hello" and "please respond." She angrily said to me, "Read them to me right now. I want to know what he said to me." I then tell her. They basically all just say hello with a question mark. She just reaffirmed in a stern voice, "Read them to me." I started reading them. "Hello, hello, please respond." She just has her eyes closed and she's nodding sometimes, commenting with things along the lines of, "That jerk, he does miss me. Well, screw him. He had his chance." She then turned quickly from this crying, distraught woman who was worried about her husband leaving her into an angry and spiteful person who felt like she was in the right. There was a couple of times when I stopped reading and I would ask if she wanted me to stop, and she would just snap at me, "Keep reading." Then I would continue. I started to feel like her husband was a crazy person with this many messages. I must have scrolled and read dozens of messages almost identical, spanning back days. My heart was racing. I felt like I was involved in something I shouldn't be involved in. I really wanted to go home, but every time I stopped, she would get really angry and tell me to keep going. That's when I came across the very first message that wasn't hello. "Stop messaging me, you crazy woman. Leave me alone. I've reported you to the police and got a restraining order. If you come anywhere near my family, you will be arrested." My heart sank. That's when I realized all the messages I had been reading so far were being sent from her phone. I paused in shock, and she again snapped at me, "Keep reading." I told her I couldn't because it was getting very late and my parents had dinner for me. She again just said, "Why don't you just come in for dinner? I'll make you something. You can let them know later you are helping your neighbor. They won't be mad, I promise." only this time she was a mixture of angry and desperate. I told her they would be worried and wonder why I was gone for so long. She pleaded a couple more times for me to not leave her, and she started crying as I stood up. Honestly, I felt really bad about it at the time. I rode my bike home as quickly as I could. My parents had just gotten home from work a little while ago and asked me where I was. I didn't tell them the truth because honestly I was a little worried that they wouldn't let me hang around the neighborhood when they weren't home anymore. A few days later I came home and there were 3 police cars out in front of her house. My heart sank. I asked my parents later that night if they knew what had happened. My dad just said, "Oh, there was just a break-in or something." I later asked one of my neighbors to see if I could get some more information about what happened. Apparently one of my neighbors fell in love with a homeless woman after inviting her in for a shower and a place to stay. He got her some new clothes and a phone and was trying to help her get a job. Turns out the reason she was homeless was because she suffered from mental illness. He then kicked her out when she started having delusions of his kid from a previous marriage being her kid as well. Honestly, he sounds like a really crappy person. She began harassing him after this, so he left the house to his parents' house and then sent the kid to his ex-wife's house. Apparently he was worried for his ex-wife and his kid's safety. He had every right to because shortly after he left, she broke a rear window of his house and then came in. She had been living in the house for nearly a week before a neighbor noticed the broken window and called the police. She apparently trashed the whole house by that point and was arrested. I almost didn't believe it, but I went behind the house and saw the broken window. I guess the guy broke his lease and moved out immediately because he was worried she would come back after getting out of jail. I don't know if she ever did try and come back, but I really hope they disclose this to the new tenants. Honestly, I still get pretty freaked out to this day. Who knows what would have happened if I went into that house.
I started working for DoorDash shortly before the pandemic hit, about 2.5 years ago, and at first I loved it. I was fresh out of high school and earning a decent amount of money making deliveries throughout Brooklyn and the surrounding boroughs. The best part of the job was being able to set my own hours, and since I had nothing better to do, I just worked as much as I could and earned as much as I could while it was possible. The only reason I stopped was that I lost my car and couldn't afford to get a new one without getting a different, less mobile job. You see, I was doing my usual routine and waiting for an order to be placed that I could pick up and make a couple of dollars. And when an order finally came through, I was quick to snatch it and begin making my way to the pickup location. It was a pizza place that I was familiar with, so finding parking to pick up the food wasn't an issue at all, and by the time it was ready to be picked up, I was there grabbing it. I made my way back to my car as fast as I could, letting the person who ordered the pizza know that their food was picked up and on the way. I looked at my phone and saw that the delivery was to an apartment building a couple blocks over, and in no time, I was en route with the food. It took me about 6 minutes to get to the block that the apartment building was located on, and luckily for me, street parking wasn't too bad at that time of day, and I managed to find a spot that was right next to the building. Now this was a no-contact delivery, which meant that I was to leave the food at the door, take a picture of it, notify the person who ordered the food that their pizza was downstairs, and then they were responsible for coming to get it. So I walked up to the door and placed the food in a safe spot, and as I was taking my phone out of my pocket, I noticed a group of young men who looked to be no older than 16 down on the corner. I couldn't help but notice they all kept looking over at me. Now in my mind, I figured that they were just thinking about trying to take the food, so I wasn't concerned for my safety at all, and I continued about my business. I took my phone out and began taking a picture of the food, and then I even called the number that I was given for the person who ordered the food to let them know that their food was downstairs. I didn't want them to miss out on any of the delicious pizza. As I hung up the phone, I took another look down the corner of the block, and this time I saw the entire group had been staring my way. I'm not sure why, but this made me feel really uneasy, and I figured that it was time for me to go. As I went to turn toward my car, out of my peripheral vision, I could see the group had started moving. They were heading toward me. Again though, in my head, these kids just wanted the food, so I tried not to freak out and continued heading to my car. That was when I heard it. One of the young men yelled out to me, "Hey, mister." I tried to ignore it, but then I heard it again. "Hey, mister, hang on a minute." To this day, I'm not sure why, but I stopped in my tracks and turned to face the group that was trying to get my attention. As I turned, though, I quickly learned what their intentions were. As soon as I was facing them, I heard 3 sounds that almost sounded like small fireworks popping off. And at the same time, I saw 3 muzzle flashes from a small handgun that one of the teenagers was carrying. I didn't feel anything at first, but when my leg buckled underneath me, I looked down and knew right away that I had been hit. I fell to the floor and the pain began to kick in. I screamed out for help, thinking that surely I was about to be killed for some unknown reason. I was somewhat thankful, however, when the group ran past me and straight to my car, which still had the keys inside. I heard the sound of people around me screaming as the car pulled off. The person who had ordered the food had come outside by that point, and they were the ones who called the ambulance for me. I never got that car back, but thankfully, I was still able to walk after all was said and done, and I definitely learned a lesson about being aware of my surroundings.
Back when I first moved away for college, my mom and dad bought me this beat-up old Toyota Matrix so I could drive home whenever I'd wanted. I grew to hate the old piece of trash after a while, but it got me from point A to B and it helped me get a job as a delivery driver for a pizza place, so I'll always appreciate the gesture. But then one night when I was making a delivery, something happened that meant that from that night on, I never got into the driver's seat of it ever again. So, like I said, I'm making deliveries one night and I'd just gotten back into my car after dropping off a bunch of pizzas at an apartment building when I suddenly realized I hadn't locked the passenger side door. And the only reason I realized I hadn't locked the door was because this guy opens up the door and climbs into my car. Then right as I'm about to tell the guy to get out, I see he has a gun. I'm too scared to even say anything, and he just points it right in my face and says all out of breath, "Drive." As I'm pulling into the street, literally trembling in my seat, I see these 2 cops sprinting out of an alley in my rear view, and that's when it hits me that they were probably chasing him, and they probably had enough time to call in my license plate. Turns out I was dead right about that because the next thing I know, I see flashing lights in the rear view. I didn't even have to look over at the guy. I just see him raise the gun up, pointing it at me, and he says, "If you stop this car, I'll blow your head off." So I drove and kept driving until we were out in the suburbs. The whole time the cops are tailing and they're not shouting like "pull over" or whatever through their bullhorns or whatever you call it, and I figured it's because they know that the guy basically carjacked me and that there's a hostage situation going on. The whole time the guy's like, "Drive faster," and all I can say is, "I can't. This thing's a piece of trash. If I put my foot down, the engine might freaking give out." So he's content to just delay the inevitable for as long as he could. I don't know exactly how long we were driving because the little digital clock was busted, but after a while we started to see fields and stuff. Then my gas light starts blinking, and I tell the guy that if we don't at least try and stop for gas, that we were eventually just going to come to a rolling stop. He tells me to stop at the next gas station we see, so that's exactly what I do. But not before the guy uses his phone to call 911, telling the operator exactly what's going on, and to tell cops that if they come near the car while we're topping up our gas, he's going to kill the hostage, i.e., me. We eventually pull into this gas station in the middle of nowhere, and I'm absolutely terrified. But I ask him if he wants me to get out to top off the tank. He looks around and sees it's one of those pumps that stays locked unless you pay first, so he says no. But he has to think of something out before he lets me get out of the car. The cops are keeping a safe distance while this is going on, as they obviously thought the guy was straight up ready to kill me. And I'd be lying if I said I didn't think that too. The whole time they're shouting over their mics like, "Let the hostage go, we can work something out," and No one has to die over this, Malcolm. Just surrender, and we'll get you help." He's stalling the whole time, pointing the gun to my head every so often to warn the cops off, and I swear that every time he did it, I thought he was going to pull the trigger and just end it. But looking back, if he did that, the cops would have just swarmed the car and shot him, or at least I think they would have anyway. Then there came a point where I could see that he was trying to work out how to get out of the mess he'd gotten himself into. He knew he couldn't get out of the car to get the clerk to unlock the pumps, as they'd ran for cover as soon as they saw that it was a dangerous situation and there was no way for him to get their attention. Then he seemed convinced that if I got out of the car, I'd run off to the cops, like, right away, which, to be fair, was my #1 escape plan at the time. He asked me how far we'd go if we just took off with the gas I had in the tank, and I told him about a mile or two, not far at all. And he lets out this real deep sigh, like a balloon deflating or something, which I suppose was exactly what was happening. He was all out of ideas. He knew this was the end of it, and right then, I realized that was the point that he was at his most dangerous. I was pretty much convinced that I was going to die by that point, having gotten it into my head that the guy was going to just go out in a blaze of glory by shooting me and then unloading the rest of his ammo onto the cops. And then when I heard him say himself, "Screw it," and he did something to the gun, like cock it or take the safety off, I thought to myself, this is it. This is how my life ends, in a trashy car with some loser maniac. I shut my eyes, felt my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard I could feel it shaking, and then bang. Only a second later, instead of feeling, well, nothing, I found I could open my eyes. But the first thing I saw when I opened them was a few specks of blood on the dash near the passenger side. Then when I turned, I instantly started dry heaving, because the guy had obviously put the gun in his mouth and pulled the trigger, because there was a ton of blood and chunks of brain matter all over the ceiling of my car. I opened up the door and was puking with my hands raised above my head while I heard the cops shouting, "Get down on the ground." I had to lie in my own puke, man. Just lie there while they ran over with their guns on me just in case I was somehow in on it. It sounds crazy, but I really didn't mind. Knowing it was all over, that I was safe, well, relatively anyway, it was all gravy by that point. Like, I don't even think I can really describe that kind of relief in actual words. I literally felt high off of it. You see and hear about people crying in the aftermath of stuff like that, and I guess that's just how they deal with the emotion. But to me, it kind of felt like I'd won something. Like I beat the carjacker by surviving or whatever. Anyway, I better sign off before this starts sounding too abstract, but I can definitely say I wouldn't wish that kind of experience on anyone, ever.
In 5th grade, our school took us on a field trip to a science museum, and it's one that I don't think I'll ever be able to forget. The more I think back on that day, the more I realize how dangerous the situation was for all of us who were there. You see, since the museum was a big place, each class was split into multiple groups, each with a different chaperone. My group consisted of me, my friends James and Peter, and we also had a new girl in our class named Elisa who was with us. One of my biggest regrets from that day was not paying more attention to Elisa. But as a kid, the only thing I was paying attention to was all the shiny things at the museum and making dumb jokes with my friends. What everyone had failed to notice was that our class had picked up one extra person who was tagging along with us. Most of us just assumed that it was one of the other students' parents that were there to chaperone, so none of us really thought twice about an extra adult, especially since he had been following us around to all the exhibits and interacting with us and our chaperones as if he belonged there. He was giving us all sorts of lessons about what certain exhibits were all about, and everything seemed normal. That all changed about 20 minutes before we all expected to load back onto the buses and head back to the school. It was at the time that Peter's mother, the woman who was our group's chaperone, noticed that Elisa was no longer with our group. She tried her best to keep calm about the situation, and she let other chaperones and the teachers know what was going on. And soon enough, security and museum staff were looking all over the place for Elisa, but after searching for about an hour, there was no sign of her. That was when the police got involved, and they ended up looking at the security footage of the museum that day. It turns out that that charismatic man that we thought was a chaperone was someone who followed our class into the museum that day. The footage from the camera showed the man kneeling down and talking to Elisa before the two both made their way outside into the parking lot. It was there that she seemed to get into the man's car on her own without being forced. The police believe that he lied about something to make Elisa believe that he was taking her back to the school or home or something of that nature. There was no sign of the man's car or Elisa for a few weeks, but then word began to spread quickly around the town that police had found her body off a small trail in the woods, off a side road just 15 minutes away from the museum. Not too many details were made public about the state of the body.
When I was around 10 years old, the most horrifying thing happened to me. I was still in elementary school at the time, and I was definitely no popular kid. I had a few acquaintances here and there, but I would overall not really talk to anyone. One day, my mom said that she was going to pick me up from school early that day, as we were going on a vacation to visit family that was about 6 hours away. That day, at around 1, I left school early and got into my mom's car. She had packed all the clothes, bathroom utilities, and stuff you would need for a long road trip. For the first few hours, I was listening to my iPad and eventually ended up taking a nap. Around, I'd say, the 4-hour mark, it was basically around 5 or 6 p.m., and it was getting dark fast, and we both were hungry and wouldn't be at our relative's house for a good 2 hours, so my mom and I decided to stop at a nearby Taco Bell. Not my favorite fast food restaurant, but I could live with it. We stepped inside and placed our orders, and once we got our food, we then sat down. So I'm sitting down talking to my mom about what we'd be doing once we got there, but she didn't seem too focused on what I was saying. She was looking over me in different directions as if she were worried or confused about something. I looked behind me but saw nothing and brushed it off as her being paranoid. So 10 minutes goes by and my mom says she has to step out to take an important phone call and that she'd be watching me through the window and that she'd be right back. So she's on the phone and I'm minding my business when I smell something extremely foul. I look to my left to see a man in his late 50s looking down at me. He said in a deep voice, "Hey young lady, my name is John, what's yours?" My mom was very strict about the whole stranger danger thing, and I was taught never to talk to strangers. This guy was very often sketchy. He had a long gray beard, cracked yellow teeth, and looked like he hadn't been to the gym in years. He said again, "Come on honey, tell me your name, I would love to get to know you." Just then, I saw my mom thankfully walking back into the restaurant and he must have caught my eye and walked away. I decided not to tell my mom about any detail of what just happened as she takes everything very seriously and told her we should go after she was done eating. A few minutes went by and my mom told me that if I had to use the restroom that I should go now as we had a long way ahead of us and probably wouldn't be stopping anywhere else. I got up and walked over to the restroom and opened the door. I was about to open one of the stalls when I heard a very familiar voice say, "Hey Rachel, wanna come home with me? I have some candy you'll like." I froze in fear and realized that it was the same man from earlier. I did not respond. I just simply walked out of the door and my mom and I then left. However, as I was in the car while my mom was pulling out of the parking spot, I looked out the window and there he was. He was still inside, waving at me with that creepy smile. I didn't look back, and I didn't tell my mom. I have absolutely no idea as to what his intentions were. Why was he in the women's restroom? What would he have done if he had gotten a hold of me? The part that still scares me till this day is how he knew my name. That still sends shivers up my spine just thinking about it till this day. I hope I don't see that creepy man again. A few months ago, I had just started working the graveyard shift at a Target in a big city on the east coast of Massachusetts. For reference, I'm a female and was 17 at the time of this story. I'm pretty short, about 5'6", and weighed about 150 pounds. The store happened to be located in a residential area that wasn't so great or safe. What I mean by that is that there would sometimes be break-ins and shootings once in a while. Let's just say the cops drove by several times a week. Because it wasn't as safe as most areas, there would always be a security guard by the front doors at all times named Chris. He was from Chicago and was a trained boxer, able to take on anyone who may pose a threat. My coworkers and I tried talking with him here and there, but he was mostly quiet and focused on himself. Having him there made me feel a lot more safe, as I have really bad asthma attacks and get frightened really easily. At the time, I didn't have my inhaler or breathing treatment with me, so an asthma attack would result in me going to the hospital. One night at around 8 p.m., I was doing my usual routine of scanning the merchandise in one of the sections of the store. As I'm putting away some shirts where they belong, I notice a man at the end of the aisle. I politely ask if he needed help, and he walks right over to me asking where the men's shoes were. I direct him to section C, and he then says, "You know, you're very beautiful." I smile and say, "Thank you very much," and continue to stock the remaining shirts. The store is pretty much dead at this point, as we don't get a lot of customers at this time of night. He thankfully goes over in the direction of the shoes, and I finish putting away the shirts. One of my coworkers, Hannah, comes over to me and asks me about the guy who I was talking to. I told her I didn't know, and we both go and get ready to clock out as we were getting ready to close. Hannah tells me to go around and check for any more people who still might have been in the store. For the most part, the store is practically empty, but I then found the same man still in section C. I politely tell him that we were closing, and he gives me this weird grin on his face. "Do you need a ride home? We can go back to my place." I tell him no and ask him to please leave the store and that we were closing. However, he doesn't listen and comes up to me and starts to grope me. At this point, I'm starting to panic, realizing what had just taken place, but knew I had to keep my breathing in check. I slowly turn around and walk toward the front entrance, telling Chris about what had just took place. Being the nice and kind-hearted person he was, he confronted him and told him that he wasn't allowed back in the store again. The guy showed no remorse and just stayed quiet while walking out of the store. Because I was still a minor at the time, Chris offered to stay behind until my parents came to get me. When they came, Chris had told them about what had happened and explained that he would inform the manager the next day. I worked at that store for another 3 months and only saw the guy once, staring through the windows. I still don't know what would have happened had Chris not been there that night.
The school was in trouble for not keeping a closer eye on their students during the trip, and the entire grade was shaken up about what happened. None of us really gotten to know Elisa, but we all wish we had.
This happened when I was in the 5th grade. I was in a science class, and one day we all took a field trip to a science museum. It had a bunch of exhibits and things like that. I really wasn't much of a science fan, but I will admit that I always liked going to the museum because it was pretty fun. We left school and drove down to the museum, which was about 30 minutes away. Once we got there, we did the usual stuff. We were able to kind of split up as a group, as long as we made it back. I went with a few of my friends in the class from one spot to another. Eventually, it was time to get lunch, and then we would leave shortly after that. Our teacher went around letting everyone know we would be leaving in 10 minutes and to meet back at the entrance. I had seen everything I was going to see, so I decided to just go back and get on the bus. That way I could play some games on my phone until we were going to leave. I left the building into the back parking lot where our bus had dropped us off. I got out there and saw a couple of buses. I started to walk over and saw the bus driver wave me over to him. I got on the bus, but as I did, the bus driver stopped me. He told me there would be no phones on the way back. I was pretty upset to hear this, and I didn't understand why, but I gave him my phone and then sat down. The bus driver then started the engine. I looked out the window and tried to think of why we weren't allowed to have our phones. Sure, sometimes the kids would get out of control with them, but I found this a little bit unreasonable. Just then, I felt the bus start to move. I looked and saw the driver was driving out of the parking lot and down to the street. I called out that the rest of the class was still inside, but he ignored me. Then I got a terrible feeling. I asked him to stop the bus and go back, but he just turned around and yelled at me to shut up. The bus was driving down the street and headed for the freeway. All I could do was look out the window and wonder what exactly was going on. I wished that I hadn't gone to the bus by myself and went back with the rest of the group. The bus driver merged onto the freeway, and we started going at a fairly high speed. The longer we drove, the more scared that I got. Now I knew the real reason he had taken my phone from me. We continued down the freeway for I would say about 5 minutes. Suddenly, I heard the noise of a police siren. I looked behind me and saw a flashing light. The bus started to move to the side of the road, and I saw a police car go with it. That was one of the greatest feelings in my life. The bus driver then opened the door and took off running into the field beside the road. I saw several police officers run after him, and another run to the bus. They were able to get me back to safety, and the bus driver was caught a short time later. In my early days of high school, I used to get to school super early in the winter because my older brother had basketball practice before school. I would usually just sit in a spot upstairs that overlooked the east entrance to the school and watch the sun rise. I found it peaceful and relaxing. On this particular day, I noticed a man walk into the school carrying a briefcase. I didn't recognize him as a teacher, so I was trying to figure out who he was. He then walked into the doors and went upstairs. He looked kind of surprised when he saw me staring at him. He smiled at me and told me he was substituting today. We shook hands and he walked away down the hall. After a while, it was time to go to class. My first period was English. About 15 minutes into class, I got a bloody nose. I would get them a lot in the winter with the dry air, and the teacher let me go to the bathroom. I went to the bathroom and held my nose over the sink and waited for it to go away. As I was in the bathroom, I noticed someone was in the far stall. I saw a suitcase on the ground in the stall. Then I remembered where I saw it before. It was the substitute teacher's. I found it really odd that he would take his suitcase into the bathroom with him, and that he would be in the bathroom at all 15 minutes into class when he was supposed to be teaching. After about 2 or 3 minutes, my nose was all better, and I washed my hands and started to head back to class. The man in the stall remained silent and still the entire time I was in the bathroom. I walked back to class and sat down. We started discussing a video we had watched. Not even 10 minutes passed by when the teacher said we were on a lockdown. She turned off all the lights in the room and locked the doors. All of us went into the corner of the room. It was completely silent. The teacher finally told us that a suspicious man was seen walking in the halls of the school. Seconds felt like minutes when we were all sitting there. It didn't take me long to realize who the man probably was. After about 30 minutes, they announced the lockdown was over. I went to the principal's office to report what I saw earlier. I then found out that the man seen in the halls was indeed the same man I had met and seen earlier that day. When a teacher saw him in the halls, he ran the other direction. The police were called and the man was apprehended. The scariest part of this is that they found a gun in his suitcase. It scares me to think how close I came to him when he was hiding in the bathroom.
About 5 years ago, when I was 16, I was living in western Pennsylvania in a heavily forested area. On this particular night, I was home alone with my younger brother, while my mom was out at a baby shower. I was in the kitchen making dinner for myself when I heard a knocking on the front porch. This wasn't a common knock, like someone might be waiting for me to open the door. It was more like a few loud taps close to one of the front windows. I paused and glanced around. From where I stood in the kitchen, I could see the front door and one of the front windows. All the lights on the ground floor were on, and with it being dark outside, all I could see in the windows was a reflection of the inside of my living room. I waited for a few moments, but when the sound didn't come again, I shrugged it off and continued concentrating on the stove. After maybe 5 minutes, long enough for me to forget about the sound, it repeated itself. This time from the front window at the far side of the house. "Mark?" I called out, thinking it might have been my brother. There was no response. I walked over to the front of the house and peered outside with my hands pressed to the side of my face, but I couldn't see anything. I turned as my brother came down the stairs. "Did you just hear something from around back?" he said. I held up a finger to indicate that we should pause and listen, and almost on cue, we heard footsteps calmly walking across the wooden floor of our wraparound porch, just outside the dining room wall. "There's someone out there," I said quietly, more angry than scared. It was at this point that we should have locked all the doors and called out the window that we were calling the cops, but I was a stupid, headstrong kid, and pissed off that someone was messing with us. I remember my brother asking if the person outside was trying to distract us, but I was already at the gun cabinet. I should point out that I was raised with guns, and I knew how to properly handle one. I pulled out the 9mm from the drawer and loaded it. "I'm going to scare him off," I told my brother. "Lock the front door behind me." Before I could even give him a chance to argue, I was marching to the door with the gun in my hands. I threw open the door and stepped out into the porch. My brother then flicked on the outside lights, and right there, about 8 feet in front of me, was a sickly thin guy wearing a hoodie with light blue eyes and a soul patch on his chin. He had been in the process of stepping onto the porch, but the moment he saw me, he spun around and ran like a bat out of hell. I took off running a few yards after him, then stopped, pointed my gun in the air, and fired off a shot. "That's right, fuck off!" I cried out. I waited until he disappeared into the trees before turning around to face the house. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that for a few moments my heart stopped. I felt that momentary wave of ice water through my veins, and the painful thudding of my heart in my chest as it tried to correct its rhythm. There was at least 8 other people standing around my porch, and a handful more scattered around the yard. They were mostly men, but there was also at least 2 women, all dressed in dark jackets and hoodies, looking mostly like they were in their early 20s. None of them said anything. Instead, they all just stared at me, their hands mostly in their pockets, and I couldn't tell if any of them had weapons. Then they all just scattered. Some jogged away, but most of them just walked off in different directions out into the woods. I legitimately forgot for a handful of seconds that I was holding a gun, until I raised my hands to my face and felt its weight. I sprinted back to the front door and pounded on it until my brother let me back in. I had no idea what to tell him. I had just fired a gun up into the air and none of them had cried out or made any sound whatsoever. Had they been drunk or something and were trying to pull a prank, they would have said something. They would have been like, "Whoa, sorry man, wrong house, put down the gun." But all they did was just look at me, like I had just ruined their surprise attack. And more disappointed than scared, they all just wandered off. I had no idea what to make of it. My brother turned on all the lights in the house and called the cops, who to their credit arrived within 10 minutes and swept the perimeter. There were footprints everywhere, and they asked my brother and I numerous times if we had just had a party. I kept telling them a dozen or more people had just been loitering around our house in the darkness. but the cops didn't seem to take it that seriously. They asked if the strangers had threatened us, and I had to admit that they didn't in any direct way. They confiscated the handgun after I told them that I fired off a round, but they eventually returned it. I have no idea to this day what those people were doing that night outside of our house. My brother suspects that they were part of some kind of cult, and maybe have been setting up to perform some kind of ritual, and maybe that we were set to be human sacrifices. I thought it more likely they intended to break in and rob us, but saw the gun and bailed. That doesn't explain the silence, though. None of them uttered so much as a sound as they looked at me and just, as if instructed by some signal, scattered all at once. I've read that during alleged UFO sightings, people can become hypnotized by lights that appear above them, and they wake up hours later in entirely new locations having no idea what happened or how they got there. I can't dismiss that kind of possibility. They all seem to be hypnotized. That group of people has never returned, and I haven't even caught a glimpse of anyone I recognized from that night in town. We bought a dog not long after.
Last year I was a senior in high school. During 5th period, I was a teacher's assistant for a science class. I would usually do whatever the teacher asked me to, like grading assignments or cleaning the lab tables. Other times, I would just do my homework or chill. It was a nice break from normal class. On this day, the science class went on a field trip, and I didn't really want to go, so the teacher let me stay back in her room and grade papers. I worked for about 20 minutes and then took a bathroom break. I got back to the room and began to grade more papers when the phone to the classroom rang. I picked it up. It was a recorded message from the principal sent to all classrooms saying they were going on lockdown as a suspicious male was seen on school grounds. I followed the directions and shut the door, locked it, and turned off all the lights. I was a little nervous being as I was all by myself in the classroom, but I knew the door was locked and I should be okay. I tried to take my mind off it by going back to grading papers. I turned on a little lamp on the desk for light. I got through about 3 more papers when I heard a noise come from the back of the classroom. The room was kind of big and had desks with lab tables behind them. I knew my mind was playing tricks on me and I kept working. Then I heard something again. This time I knew it wasn't my imagination. I looked closely around the classroom. When I got to the back corner lab table, I saw it. There was a man's shoe and part of his leg that I could barely see. I was frozen and didn't know what to do. I wanted to run for the door, but I didn't know if I could make it and unlock it in time if he chased me. The teacher's desk was kind of far from the door, but I knew I had to risk it. I didn't want to stay in the room with him. I counted to 3 and then got up and calmly walked to the door. About 3 steps from the door, and I heard more noise as if the man was getting up. At that point, I reached for the door as fast as I could, unlocked it and opened it. I slammed it shut behind me and ran as fast as I could down the hall. I heard the door open behind me. I saw the nearest staircase and ran upstairs hoping to lose the man if he was following me. I didn't even know if he was chasing me, but I was scared out of my mind. I got upstairs and pounded on the nearest classroom door. The teacher let me in after about 10 seconds. The man did not follow me upstairs. I got in the room and explained everything as fast as I could to the teacher, who then made a call to inform the principal. It ended up being too late and the man was able to escape. I figure he snuck in the classroom as I went to the bathroom, and I don't know if he had intentions to harm me or not, but I'm just glad that I'm okay.
My name is Daniel, and I was about 20 years old when this happened to me at a Taco Bell. I've always been the type of person who would eat fast food almost every day. Whether it would be for lunch or dinner or even a snack, I would almost go out for fast food at least once a day. I know, not that healthy, but that's just how I live. One night, I had just finished my shift from my full-time job and working over 8 hours at a car dealership. I was driving and planning to head home, but thought about doing my daily routine of getting some fast food. The dealership I worked at is kind of in a rural area, which I guess is in the outskirts of my city, which means that there aren't a lot of places around. My house is about a 20-mile drive depending if there's traffic or not. Anyway, I didn't see a McDonald's or Burger King or anything like that. However, I decided to take a different way, hoping I would find a place to eat that was open late. I ended up seeing a Taco Bell up ahead. Not my favorite fast food place, but at least it's food and I couldn't drive home without anything in my stomach. I pulled into the parking lot, got out of my car, and walked in. I ordered my food, sat down at a table, and enjoyed the tacos I was having. I was there for about a good 15 minutes before I was done and planning on leaving. I walked out of the door with my phone in hand, texting one of my coworkers when some guy ran up to me out of breath. He looked tired and thirsty and was very sweaty as if he just ran a marathon. He said to me while still hyperventilating, Hey man, do you think you could just spare me a few dollars? I just need a soda or something. I told him that I wasn't sure as I don't really carry cash often, but that I would check in the car for a few dollars. I was in my car looking for some money in the back seat when I hear my passenger car door open and then close. I look to see the man in the passenger seat holding a gun in his hands, pointing it directly at my face. You could imagine the panic I was in, and my blood turned cold, and it didn't help that he had a very angry look on his face. He said these exact words, "Now, you are going to listen to exactly as I say, or I won't hesitate to shoot you in the head and blood and the brain matter will be all over the inside of your car." I remained calm and said, "Okay, so what do you want me to do here?" He said to pull up the GPS on my phone and to drive to a specific address. At this point, I'm pissing myself and hoping that one of the employees at Taco Bell would see this, but they didn't notice, and I didn't want to risk trying anything to get help. I put in the given address and it was about 10 miles. I put my car into drive and we start making our way over there. The more I started to look at him, the more angry he got and the closer the gun got to my head. I then came to a red light and decided to make a decision. I'm a pretty big guy, 6'5", and when I was 10, my grandfather would always take me hunting and even taught me how to take a gun away from someone before he unfortunately passed away. I decided to listen to my grandpa's advice, but it's been so long since he taught me how to take a gun away from someone, but I had to try it and I knew this was my chance. I tried to remember the steps and attempted to grab the gun from him. The gun eventually dropped to the floor, but thankfully I was faster than he was and I grabbed the gun before he did. I pointed at him and said, "Now you listen to me. If you don't get out of my car, I will shoot you." He then got out of my car and started walking along the sidewalk, never to be seen again. I finally made it home safe and I felt relieved. I then gave the gun to the authorities, but I don't know what happened to it after that. And I still have no idea where he was leading me to, and what would have happened had he gotten the gun first when it fell. I still have nightmares about it happening. So, I guess the lesson is to be careful out there, and not to go to Taco Bell or any other fast food restaurant so late at night. You never know what could happen.
My school was really small, and basically the entire place went. It took us over an hour to get there, but when we were there, it was a day-long event, which was nice for us because we didn't actually have to do any schoolwork. I think I was like 8 years old, and I was one of the younger people there. The first part of the day we spent looking for a bunch of animals, then we got food. After that, we started looking more at plants and things like that. I was more into the animals, so my friend Matt and I went back over to them. We first got back to the exhibit of sea lions, and when we got there, one of the zoo workers asked us if we wanted to help feed the animals. Of course we said yes, because as an 8-year-old kid, it seemed like something super fun to do. He told us to follow him and then led us into a doorway and down a dark and quiet hall. It was really weird to be in the back of an exhibit, but it got me really excited to feed the animals. We followed the guy deeper in, and into a storage type of room that was even darker. He said this is where they kept the food. He told us to wait there for a second and left the room. Then we saw the door shut and heard it lock. We immediately knew something was wrong. I went to the door and tried to open it, but it was in fact locked. It was a really strong and thick door, and neither of us would be able to break it. We banged on it, but I don't know how anyone else outside would be able to hear. After a while of that with no response, we decided to examine the room. It was very dark with no apparent lights, and we could barely see. It was probably just about 15 feet by 10 feet, and I had basically just junk laying around. It just seemed to be another storage closet. We waited and waited, but of course, the guy never came back. and nobody else did either. This was kind of a long time ago, and neither of us had cell phones we could take out to call anyone or anything like that. We just waited in the dark room for what felt like forever. Occasionally we would yell or bang on the door, but nothing would ever happen. We did this for literally hours. At one point we stopped and actually fell asleep on the floor for some time. Eventually we got back up and went back to banging on the door and yelling. At last, finally, we could barely hear someone from the other side. We both yelled as loud as we possibly could. The door tried to open, but was still locked. Then whoever was there went away. We got really disappointed and thought that was it, until a few minutes later we saw the door open. There was another zoo worker, and she asked us how we had gotten in there. We told her the story, and she seemed really surprised. By that time, we saw that the sun was almost set when we got back into the zoo. Apparently, everyone had been looking for us for over 2 hours. We were able to get back home later that day, but the guy that worked there and locked us in had left, and nobody could find him. It turns out he was caught a while later, and had been addicted to some drugs or something like that. They said he had been acting really strange lately. I really don't know why he locked us in there, but we were very lucky to get out because that closet wasn't really used by the zoo anymore.
When I was about 19 or so, I got my first ever real job working at a gas station during the spring. It wasn't the best paying job, but it was enough to get my foot through the door to start making payments for college and stuff. I lived by myself in a small one-bedroom apartment that my parents paid for, but got the job in the meantime to cover other expenses. My managers, being the jerks that they were, gave me a week of night shifts knowing I had a 7 a.m. class every morning. It was annoying to say the least, but I really needed the money. During the night shift, you'd have people constantly come in and out for gas, and right around the 10 p.m. mark, business would be slow for the most part. After that, you'd maybe have 1 or 2 shady people come in once an hour for a snack or cigarettes. That being said, it's still a pretty good time where I could chill out for a few hours. One night, I was on my shift as usual and had just finished serving what I thought was the last customer for the night as I was about to end my shift. As I'm packing up and getting ready to leave, a car pulls up right in front of the store and a man gets out. He wore a stained white shirt and had a scruffy beard with messy hair. He walks right in and I greet him with a hello and asked if I could help him with anything. He completely ignores my question and walks over to the refrigerators and grabs a 6-pack of beer. I live in the South, so people like this were very common around here. I tell him his total and he then says something that made my skin crawl. "Hey, you're really pretty. I love your hair." Laughing awkwardly, I tell him thanks and he proceeds to hand me a $10 bill. Making sure our hands touched. I give him his change and tell him to have a good rest of his night and go on my phone, hoping he'd get the hint to leave me alone. He thankfully left and I waited for my coworker who was working after me to arrive so I could go home. However, he must have been running late because it was 10 minutes past his shift and I was getting a bit annoyed. 10 minutes turned into 20 and then eventually 30. As I was about to call him to see where he was, I then noticed someone hiding behind one of the gas pumps. It was a little hard to see, but because of the light, I could make it out to be the same man from earlier. I had no idea as to what he was doing, but I could tell that it clearly wasn't good. He then comes out from behind the pump, and I see that he's clearly hiding something behind his back, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I grabbed my keys and was headed out toward my car, when I see him approach the front door giving me this unsettling look. It was a look of hatred and fury. Suddenly he pulls out a gun and proceeds to show it to me as if he wanted me to know that he was armed. At this point, I'm frantically dialing 911 on my phone, and he then shoots the lock and steps inside yelling at me while having me at gunpoint. He orders me to give him all the money in the register or he won't hesitate to pull the trigger. I take a few deep breaths and calmly hand him the money we had, and he then takes off down the road. I call the police while bawling my eyes out in fear, and the operator tells me to stay on the line with her until an officer arrived. Thankfully, the guy never made it too far, as police had managed to track him down. Turns out, this guy was wanted for assault and murder. The next day, I quit my job at that gas station and now work at my local supermarket.
I worked at a museum a couple of years back, maybe a decade ago. I was a night shift security guard. It was as boring as you could imagine, but I desperately needed the money in it.
I'm 28 years old, but when I was about 5 years old, my mom and I lived in this duplex that was off a main road and kind of in a wooded area. We lived on one side and the other was a woman and her son. He was studying to be a teacher. My mother had me pretty young, so she was about 25 years old and the guy was in his early 20s. He would often come and talk to my mom. My mother said that he would ask a lot of questions about me and asked my mother if it would be alright for him to take me for walks in the woods. Of course, my mother always declined. My mother worked in the operating room at the local hospital and was on call a lot, so most of the weekends I stayed at my grandma's house. One night while I was at my grandma's house, my mom was home alone, sleeping. She woke in the middle of the night and said she doesn't remember if she heard something or felt someone in the room, but she woke up. She could see feet wearing socks that were sticking out from the end of her bed. She grabbed her bedside lamp and was about to hit the intruder when our neighbor then yelled her name and then said his name. He couldn't really explain why he was naked and only wearing socks, but he begged my mother not to tell his mother about it. My mother, of course, called the cops. She ended up going to court and making a victim impact statement against this guy because she was absolutely terrified that he'd become a teacher and be around children. She says that she's pretty sure that he was there for me that night and was so happy that I wasn't there. We ended up moving pretty much immediately after that happened. She just couldn't stay another night in that house. I'm just really glad that nothing happened to me or my mother. Who really knows what would have happened if he would have succeeded in whatever he was trying to do that night?